want to take a couple of minutes to reflect on what John Eisenberg has meant for me. And honestly, as I think about that legacy and what LDI means to the country right now and what it should mean to the country moving forward, the lessons that we can take from John and from that legacy as we try to make the world a better place. One of the funny things in basic science that we've learned is actually it turns out that the exposures that a baby has in utero, so the things that happen to them, whether it's the environment and what the mother eats, the stress, it turns out they actually have effects on that baby for their entire life. Metabolic effects change their obesity, change their patterns. So we can all kind of understand that. Maybe there are things that happen when you're in utero that change who you are 40, 50 years later. But the incredibly bizarre thing is that those effects, right? So an exposure in utero not only affects that baby, but affects that baby's babies. And those babies' babies' babies, right? The great-grandchildren. And we're now understanding what that biology is, the kind of idea that there's epigenetic transformations that change what happens in the tissues that get carried forward. But I would tell you that what we have here today with John, with Mark, with Bill Kissick, is an intergenerational transmission of a commitment to the health and healthcare of this country that goes from generation to generation and is transmitted from what John taught his trainees, what they taught me, and what I try every day to bring to the people training at the Massachusetts General Hospital and every person in this room. So that intergenerational transmission is invaluable, and I really can see John in so many generations across the country right now. So Dee, I want to thank you for what you shared with the world here, for what you guys did, and I just want to have a round of applause for John for a second. So then I want to tell some stories, because if I'm not going to tell a story about Sandy in a car, like, I'm not standing up here, okay? Let me just tell you, I got some stories. So I want to tell a story, actually. I left, so John had left Penn by the time I arrived, but the first time I met John was actually in the Division of General Medicine. He came to visit, and he was nice enough, and I scheduled some time to meet with him. And John actually told me a story that I carry forward with me and I teach everybody that I work with from now on. We were talking about what I should study and what was important for health and healthcare. And he told me that if I wasn't sure, I should talk to my taxi drivers. And that actually the best thing that he did was that when he flew into a different city, he would ask a taxi driver about their healthcare and ask them what was right and what was wrong and what wasn't working. And he said, honestly, if it doesn't matter to your taxi driver, you probably need to think again about what you're doing. And if you can't explain it to your taxi driver, you need to work really hard on figuring out how to study something that matters. And so we're here at 50 years of LDI, and we're celebrating the power of evidence to inform policy, what it means to be driven by data, how we think about big data, how we think about regression models, things like Bayesian shrinkage estimators that I think Rachel Werner taught me at some point. And I will tell you that John was completely comfortable in worlds of big data. But the remarkable thing I would say is that we have to learn how to do something that I think John did so well, which was to hold both the truth of the data and the evidence, but also the truth of the story and the person who at the end is who we're trying to serve. So when I took over general medicine following the lineage of John and Sankey, who I just would also love to say that Sankey is just such a force for good across the University of Pennsylvania, across this country, and I could not be more grateful to Sankey for everything that he has meant to so many of us. So I took over this, and one of the things that had been impressed upon me, maybe this is Ralph, where's Ralph, was that one of the great frontiers was physician compensation. And in fact, partly this might be a little bit of a Mark Pauly story, is that when we took over the clinical scholars here, we were trying to get Mark to come and teach economics. And Mark said, well, you know, I'm willing to come teach the clinical scholars economics because one of the things I still don't understand is physician behavior and compensation. He said, as far as I can tell, we've studied it forever, and it's a complete black box. I don't know if you remember this, Mark. He said it's a completely bizarre thing because if you pay them more for something, they do more. That makes sense. If you pay them less, they do more, and that doesn't make sense at all. I don't know if you remember that conversation. So when I took over the division, we had about 80 doctors in the division, and I was convinced that I was going to make sense out of their compensation. So I got a huge number of variables about those doctors, as you can imagine. I measured their FTE and their RVUs and their academic time. And I put them all in a regression model, and I figured out how I could, who was an outlier. And I spent so much time on that. I won't use the words that I tend to use. I grew up in a boarding school playing soccer, and it turns out that those tendencies keep with you for a very, 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 very long time. Some of the people who are clinical scholars were here will remember that we were trying to train me not to use those words. And for a while, if I used one of those words, I had to do 10 push-ups. Does anybody in here remember that phase? It turns out I actually got relatively good at push-ups, but it didn't change my language at all, so I gave up. But so I love that regression model. And it took about a year or so into the job for me to realize that actually my job was not about that regression model or making the fit just right? I wasn't there to somehow get that R squared to wherever. I was there because behind that regression model are individuals with hopes, dreams, fears, and aspirations. And our job as leaders, or as managers, or as physicians, as mentors, was to understand those stories and to bring those stories forward and to make them real. I think the reality is when you live in the world of policy, and one of the things that we teach a lot is this paradox of why doesn't data drive policy, right? Why is it that data is so ineffective? And why do stories drive policy? Well, I'd like to suggest to you that John taught me that we can hold both of those truths, that evidence and data are critical, but the stories and interpersonal connections, the people who make up those data, who are those observations, are the greatest asset that we have for making the world a better place and driving policy. And I think John embraced the power of both of those tools. And they'll recognize the frustration that we used to have. Well, how can it be that I can show all these great data and that people still won't change what they do? But I can tell one story. And I remember watching people, they were so angry. It's like something's wrong with the human brain, right? Maybe we can map it and cut that part out. And they'll just want to hear about the numbers and they won't want to hear the stories. And I guess what I want to suggest to you is that's not a problem. That is the greatest gift that we have, and we need to embrace it in healthcare and at the training and every mission that we do. And so I want to tell you a couple of stories about the people who I think fundamentally make up the LDI, make up what this institution has meant to the country and what we can all do. Some of those people, right, are the mentors that we all have. The people whose single touches sometimes change the course of your career. So Sandy Schwartz was one of my early mentors, and I came to Penn not knowing what I wanted to do. I was quite lost at the time. I actually thought I would never leave Hopkins at that time. I think it took me about 2 years to stop saying, but at Hopkins we did. I don't know how many of you guys remember that. So Sandy found me at some point in a conference. Actually, for most of the time I thought he was Brian Strom. I got them confused completely. I couldn't keep them separated for a long time. Yeah, I was like, okay, the guy without the beard is Sandy, I got it. And Sandy said, I'm going to a conference at NIH on cost effectiveness. Would you like to come? He didn't know me. He didn't know anything about me. He just knew that he could make a difference. So I will tell you the story, though, so I was no fool, right? I said, absolutely, I'd love to come. So he said, okay, I'll meet you here at 8 o'clock in the morning. So I didn't have the agenda at that time, but so Sandy came, I got in his car, which was a car Sandy drives very fast. I don't know how many of you have driven with Sandy. But so it turns out Sandy is on the agenda, like I think the first conference on cost effectiveness at the Nash Center in DC at noon, okay? So Sandy picks me up at 9 o'clock, we have about, it was a little bit late, and then he says, actually I've been up all night painting my living room and I ran out of paint. So we have to go to Marion, where the paint store opens at 10. And then we will get down to DC. At which point I'm like, oh my goodness. I should have said no. I never say no. Let there be a lesson for life. I'm going to say no. So we drove, let's just say toll booths, not an obstacle. Let's just say, turns out you can pay fines later. It's not a big deal. So we drove to DC. We get there, honestly, I think Sandy's on the podium at noon. We get there at 11:58. As you can imagine, most of the leadership of the conference is out at the, at the drop-off area in front of the Natcher Center. Sandy gets out. The remarkable thing I will say, Sandy, is that he had a tie in his trunk, which I don't know what's happened to the ties in your trunk, but there were ties. He got out. He put on his tie. I parked the car. And he gave the best talk about cost, where we should head and thinking about cost that anybody had ever heard. The line of people to talk to Sandy after that went all the way back out to the car, essentially, where I had no idea where to put it. And so I will tell you, those small things that you do for your mentees, the times that you take them along mean more than anything else. And what John did and that intergenerational transmission that has reached me has just been so unbelievably valuable. I'll tell you a story about another LDI director who's one of my mentors. So David Ash, who's sitting here also, when I joined the faculty, and for all those of you I teach negotiation about how to get a job, somebody convinced me that I needed to get a part-time of a secretary. I don't know how many of you guys have been told that in your, I'm sure lots of people have. I try to talk them out of this all the time. Turns out I had no use for a secretary, right? Like nobody wanted to meet with me. I really didn't want anybody keeping my schedule. Like that was not a good idea. I didn't have a telephone really, so like what was I gonna do? But so I got a secretary because I was convinced I needed a secretary, which was a big mistake. And so I got part-time secretary. She didn't have anything to do, so she spent most of her time surfing the web, looking at porn sites. So, Ralph, I think this was before we figured out how to stop that on the web, just so you know, now that's all been restricted. And I actually remember, so I had this like aha moment where I'm like, well, I need to leverage this somehow. And so I met with David in passing, and I was like, well, we gotta figure out, like, this is driving me crazy. I gotta figure out something to do here. And we decided to do a study looking at the availability of Viagra directly marketed to consumers. It was the first time that there was direct marketing coming up. And David mentored me through a study that was completely conducted by my secretary, who should have been doing something else. But let me just tell you, she knew all the sites. And you know what? It was the first paper I ever published in the New England Journal. We sent it to the New England Journal, and they didn't say, like, yes with revisions. They said, sure. And I thought, wow, this is a lot easier than people said it was going to be. So I guess the point I make about that is that mentors are unbelievably important. It is a gift of love and kindness and generosity that each of you give to your mentees. And I just want to encourage you to recognize that you really never know where that will all go. And I'm so incredibly grateful for that. I also just want to talk for a second about another type of tie, a really important tie that I think is so critical for why we're all here today. And actually in a funny way explains why I'm in Boston and so many of us are where we are. So one of my favorite papers, it was written by a guy named Mark Granovetter, who is a sociologist at Stanford. I don't know, it's a paper called A Strength of Weak Ties. How many of you have read that paper? If you haven't read it, please, it's just an amazing paper. So the story is that Mark was a graduate student at Harvard, actually, and studied how people got their jobs I think in the financial sector, but outside in Boston. And what he discovered was that actually people got their next step, like the big next job, not from the people they knew well, not from what you would call our close ties or that bonding social capital, the people who are just like us. But the big steps forward actually came from what he called weak ties. People who you bumped into a little bit, who you had a conversation with, who were related to your brother-in-law. I think everybody somehow is related to Sandy's brother-in-law, so I've decided. But somehow it was that weak tie that made the biggest possible difference. And I think that is so fundamentally what LDI is about. It's about bringing people together from different areas that have an ability to find an interest for a moment that can change the force of where we're going to go. It turns out one of the reasons I partly love that story was that Mark's paper, The Strength of Weak Ties, is probably called something else, was rejected like 12 times. So it was rejected from his dissertation was rejected time and time again. And I am not kidding when I'm going to tell you right now that that paper has been cited over 30,000 times. There are more studies of the role of weak ties across sectors in our society and across the world than almost any other phenomenon. So there's a message there about perseverance, but I think there's also a message about what it means to connect across barriers, to reach out, to talk to somebody who you don't know. It turns out that my boss is a guy named Peter Slavin, the president of Massachusetts General Hospital, who did also Sandy. I will say, when I said I was coming down here, he said, Sandy Schwartz is one of the nicest people I've ever met in academic medicine. So I said, yes, he is. So Peter Slavin will tell you a funny story. He believes, and I don't know if this is true or not, that the person who convinced him that I should be at the top of the list for the job at Massachusetts General Hospital was a woman named Elizabeth Martinez. I don't know if any of you know Elizabeth Martinez. Turns out she was an anesthesiologist at Johns Hopkins, came up to Massachusetts General later. But I knew her when I was a chief resident. I talked to her when I was a chief resident. She was a medical student on my service. And what I remember about is she wanted to study quality of care, and Hopkins was telling her that that was insane. It was a terrible thing to do, and if she wasn't going to be in a basic science lab, she was dead to them. And I think I basically told her to do whatever she wanted. For those of you who know me, I say that a lot. And she was the person that went to the MGH board and said, this is the woman you need. And you think about that weak tie and how those things play out. So I just want to say I think it's about weak ties. And then I'm going to finish by saying that in the end, what I think are the most important stories we have are actually about our patients. When we think about healthcare and economic forces, when we think about healthcare reform or what goes on in politics, we think about all of these things. I think fundamentally it comes back to the individuals who are in the Massachusetts General Hospital right now, or somebody's mother, somebody's daughter, somebody's brother, who don't know how to get the treatment they need, don't know if they can afford it, who don't know whether the quality of the care they're getting is okay, who don't know whether or not this is going to change their family. It's about the people who don't even have access to hospitals, to any type of facility. And I think it is those stories that we need to revisit and find. That there's data that drives this all. But the fundamental truth about the unbelievable gift of being in healthcare is that it is really about the ability to reach an individual patient who's scared, who doesn't know what's going to happen, and change the course for what that means. And so I will just say to all of you who are here that John Eisenberg is an immense, immense leader in healthcare. And we know him for what he did for quality of care. We know him for what he did for health services research. We know him for this intergenerational transmission. But I will tell you what I know him for is that I never ever get in an Uber or a Lyft now without asking that person driving the car, well, how do they feel about their health care? And how are we doing, and what are we doing wrong, and what are we doing right? And I never, ever forget that at the end of the day, what matters most is not that New England Journal paper or even that conference, but it's what is happening for the patients who are in the hospital right now and the patients that we are trying so incredibly hard to keep out of that hospital. So I am incredibly grateful to be here. It feels like coming home in so many different ways. And I want to thank Dan, thank everybody here. I'm really delighted to be able to spend the rest of the day with everybody and look forward to the dialogue. Thank you very much.